Kia ora he uri tēnei o Te Atiawa me Taranaki, ko Alice Tupuna Lahau. I teach at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and one of the great joys of the last 3 years of my life has been a Marsden funded project called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. The project spends time going all around the region, 1900 to 1975, a period that we actually don't know that much about. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of first adventures and connections with Europeans coming into the region, and we talk about more recent things, but particularly in the area of writing and literary studies, which is my own background. It's kind of like what really happened between the end of the kind of contact colonial period and Albert Wendt, like what happened in that time in between. Writing the New World has brought together 16 different Indigenous researchers from all around the region with really different backgrounds and different perspectives and different skills. And the podcast is intended to feature their views, their ideas, their experiences, so that you also can have an opportunity to connect with this writing, but also with the region that it comes from. The whole concept of the podcast is so much that happens at universities, really are things that people beyond the university might be interested in hearing about. We're interested in celebrating the writing from this time period, but also celebrating the work of the amazing researchers that have worked on the project. And so we are hopeful that members of their communities and the members of the communities that produce this writing in the first place would find these podcasts to be interesting, and maybe would have them ask some questions and feel interested in knowing a bit more about the writing of their own communities. In order to contribute to the New Zealand Pacific and Māori Language Weeks, in 2020 a special issue of the podcast is being launched with each of those language weeks, featuring people from those language communities speaking about their research in that language.
Fakaalofa lahi atu. Talafalava. I'm your podcast host, Wanda Yermia Allen. Faliki e tau momoui he tau atu. Hau ke he Vagahau Niue. This year's theme advocates for Niuean people to not only respect and treasure our languages and cultures, but to work daily to ensure the foundation of Niuean language remains strong for generations to come. I discussed Dr. Jess Pasisi, our Niuean Postdoc Research Fellow and mental health researcher, Poimatangi's work on Niue Happiness and mental health, which speaks directly to this theme. It was a real honour and pleasure to interview Dr. Jess Pasisi and Poimatangi on their meaningful research, which not only speaks to who they are, but also of their love of family and of Niue. Whakawelahi atu to our guests. Enjoy.
Whakalofa lahi atu. Ko hingoa ako ko Poimatangi. Ne hawa o maanga ko Okalani. In terms of my village, my family are from Mutolo and Tuapa. Poimatangi is my dad's name, he's from Tuapa. Thought I'll share a little bit about who I am for this. So, yeah, my family from the islands of Niue, but also Samoa. My full name is actually Corianton Tuhanga Junior Poimatangi. Corianton's not a Niuean name, but I thought I'll explain where it came from. So my family kind of converts into the Mormon faith, and so it's a name of a person that's in the Book of Mormon. I haven't asked my parents why they named me Corianton, but I think it just sounds cool. So that's my first name. My second name is Tuhanga Junior, and so that's my father's name's Tuhanga, and so I'm like Tuhanga Junior. And our surname is Poimatangi, but he's actually an Okasene. So there's a Samoan connection, and if you follow the warriors, Haitra Okasene is my cousin. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself from my family. Right now I live in Hamilton. I'm married to a so her family are Dutch and English, Heidi. So I've got my children who are half Pacific Island, Niuean, Samoan, and Dutch and English. Got 3 girls, Esther, Nadine, and Demelza, who was just born during the lockdown. So they were all at home keeping me busy. But one of the reasons why I enjoy what I'm doing. So that's me.
Whakalofa lahi atu ki o Motoro Osi, ko ingoa haku ko Jess Pasisi, o maanga ko Mutalo Ululotaha. My father is Ben Pasisi, part of the larger Pasisi family from Mutalo. And yeah, my name is, well, my family is connected to that area, but also to Hikitawaki and Makefu. And my dad came across in the or his family came across the 60s and 70s. So he came across when he was about 17, brought his tohitapu, his Bible with him, and that was kind of it. So that was all he brought to Aotearoa.
And my family, my parents moved from Niue to New Zealand in the 1980s. And so I've got 4 brothers and 4 sisters. So I'm number 4 in the family, and pretty much most of us were born here in New Zealand.
My mother is Pākehā, but also connected to Ngāti Pukeao and Tahiti, and she grew up in the Waikato her whole life, and met my dad at the Waikato hospital, and they had sparks flying in the kitchen there, which is, that's where the romance is. So and they had 6 kids. I am the 5th of 6, 1 boy and 5 girls. My name actually comes from a porcelain doll that my mother had recently purchased just before my birth, and because I came out so Palangi looking, they decided to give me a Palangi name as my first name, Jessica, and then my middle name Lily connects me back to Niue. Our family name Pasisi is actually, my dad tells me that it's a name that my grandfather picked for himself. So he was adopted into a new family, and he called himself Pasisi, and it stuck. So that's how our name comes about.
Cool. Do you want to tell us about your roles here at Waikato?
So my role here at the university, I've got work experience in health, mainly mental health. So I'm one of the accessibility advisors. It's more like a disability support for students who have disabilities, and I've been in the role for 2 years, just over 2 years. My first role in the tertiary institution. And so that's one of my things I enjoy doing, is helping people and those with disabilities, and making sure that there are some supports for students. So that's my role here now.
And you're also the president of Untitled Chapter.
Yes, my other roles.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll talk about more other roles. Yes, and we have a Untitled Niue Waikato club group here. It was started by Jess. She passed it over to me. So I'm more the president of it. And we're a very, very small group. But we're hoping, part of this whole Niue Language Week, and more around Niue exposure, that through that role we could tap into other Niueans who are under a rock somewhere, or just to make sure that this community is kind of there for them, for us. So those are my 2 roles, and maybe one other thing, I'm also a part-time student at the university, so I'm doing a master's in Counselling program. So I'm doing a bit of right now, just doing my placement, just learning how to use the skills and kind of get that knowledge. It's important. Yeah,
that's so cool. I think that's a cool thing about Waikato, is that it has a surprising amount of Niue people who have come here, both as students and staff. Like even John Pule did a residency here.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. We've got some of his art somewhere, I think in the Performing Arts Centre. Yeah, and my cousin Coral came here.
Okay, who else? Who else did this?
All the famous people.
All the famous Niueans.
Yeah. But no, there's like always, there's some connections here, so that's cool.
Yeah.
Jess, tell us about your work here at Waikato.
Yeah, so I am a postdoctoral research scholar. I am in the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies, and within that I'm in Pacific and Indigenous Studies, and I really love the role that I'm in right now. It's like it's funded by the Health Research Council of New Zealand, and it means that I can focus on a specific project, which is the Niue Happiness project, which is really good to kind of follow on from my PhD, which was looking at Niue women's perspectives and understandings of climate change. And kind of to extend that and look more specifically at mental health and well-being in Niue communities, and do that from a strengths-based and positive aspect. So thinking about happiness, what does that mean to us, and how can we ensure that more Niue people in the community actually are happy or are able to have a really high or strong sense of well-being in their everyday life. And I think that's always been important, like across.
Yeah, and remember when you told me about this project that you're doing, I was really on board with it, because it's mental health and well-being is not only like something I've studied through, but it's kind of been important through my family, especially Niue Happiness. Yeah. Niue Happiness. Niue Happiness, which is and that project is something I like to see, especially other Niue people. That's not just in Auckland, which is where I'm from, and so just to see what's happening outside of other parts of New Zealand, which are important.
and it's so integral to your studies at the moment as well, Corey, isn't it not?
Yeah, yes, and so part of it was my counselling program that I'm doing. I'm planning on doing some research, and I spoke to Jess about it. Very, very new to research, and very new. So I'm just learning all that, but my one is around spirituality for Niue people, and what that looks like on traditional and those who were born in New Zealand, and just the challenges that can come from it for and a lot of it really links to resilience is the what I'm looking at. But it's that's the idea. I just have to learn, and it's good to have people like Jess here who I can ask questions about certain things, but how research works. But no, that's very, very integral.
Yeah, I think it's a bigger moment that our Niue community is having at the moment. Like there's quite a few Niue people engaged in research in the space of like health and well-being, and it's about kind of connecting the cultural and language aspects to understand that space better. Because I think often, historically there's been a kind of really Western view about how we approach these kinds of things, but it kind of ignores or sidelines a lot of the really rich cultural kind of models and concepts that can be used to support people better in this space. So it's kind of good for both of us to be here at the same time.
Yeah, definitely, especially if I'm bringing it closer to home. I'm married to a non-Niuean or non-Niue person, or someone that didn't have much knowledge around Pacific, and so it's important in that way too. Like girls have to learn what it is around Niue Happiness for them, and it's kind of close in that way. So really cool to see how we can help with that, because I can imagine there's others who more around that, and that's the mental health side of it. I think that's that I've kind of seen.
Having defined and developed specific Niue methodologies for research, our guests talk about their own personal journeys of identity, celebration, migration, going back to Niue, their own diasporic experiences, and family-defined notions of success.
I think the other half of your research is like very identity focused, and I think growing up I wasn't always that proud to be a Niue person. Like I didn't really fully understand what it meant to be from Niue and why that was important or how that could, the strength that gives you. And I kind of think, I used to lean more heavily on my Pākehā side because, or my Palangi side, because I was like, this is the path that, largely we're meant to go. Whereas, I think you're kind of lucky with your partner because she's so supportive of your daughters getting to know their heritage and for you to express that. I mean, Heidi probably knows more Niue songs than a lot of Niue people.
Yeah, she's learning and she actually knows quite a bit of Māori too. I don't know if I've asked you this. When did you realise that was something that you wanted to look into the Niuean?
It actually came late, so it was when I started my PhD that I realised that what I was doing, which was looking at climate change, could actually be something more important that I could do for my community. And so I took my parents over just before I turned 25. I think I turned 25 on the plane ride back. So flying over the Moana house, and now I'm 25.
Okay.
But that trip was really important. Important for a couple of reasons. One was that I got to go back to Niue with my dad, which I think is an experience that every Niue person should have the opportunity to go to Niue, but also with an elder from their family. Yeah. It changes the view. You can go there on your own and you can learn stuff and maybe you can experience the environment more, but the deeper cultural stuff, it needs someone from your family, or you need to connect with your family for it to have more meaning. So
I think because I was born in New Zealand, and first time I went to Niue was when I was when our oldest was 9 months. But because Niue only has weekly flights, and my family went 2 weeks before, and we crossed paths, so we didn't get to. My dad hadn't been there in years, and I remember talking to my sister who was with my dad, and she was saying how he would just be off doing his thing. Yeah,
my dad was the same. Off the plane, into the bush, go and set up the unga traps.
Oh, he was that shit because he wouldn't come home till late with his his cousins, and because I went with my family, we were we're like tourists. Which is alright, which is cool. Yeah. But I'd like to go with probably someone like my dad. Yeah. Just to it's good because I talked to some of our family that I've not met before. But I reckon if my dad and I was with my mum, they probably would have different experience with it.
Yeah, and they point different things out, this is where your family is buried, or this is your family's house, this is my grandmother's house, this is the track that goes down to our plantations, which are really afar, they're 10 kilometres sometimes or more.
I still remember it,
Yeah, and it's just there, and I think it's different to how they might talk about it outside of Niue. I've never had those kind of conversations with my dad before, but as soon as his feet are on the ground and can kind of that kind of memory that comes through, groundedness and connecting with a particular environment it's so, you just can't replicate that anywhere else.
No, yeah. And I guess that will be something I'm, part of my research about Pacific identity, and, if you grew up and born in the islands, coming here, which I'm sure there's a lot I can think of that I can see now that my parents would have to adjust to, and stuff. And all the stories too. That's one of my favourite things is that my dad would take us to his school up in Coffee up in and I mean it's pretty dilapidated now. Part of it's there.
Yeah, there's a structure, but thinking about he would say kind of stories about school, waiting for the milk to come through, and getting in trouble for speaking Vagahau, and kind of skiving off school, or missing the bus when the schools moved to the kind of central Halamahanga area. Hey, so that's if you miss the bus, then what are you gonna do?
Can't walk there, but yeah.
Yeah.
But stories are interesting. and it's, my stories from my dad were more around, like, I think he enjoyed. But it's funny how, like rugby, he enjoyed playing rugby.
Hey.
I remember asking, like, man, was there grass, because it's a rock, it's but yeah, same thing at school, like, I think he got into a fight with someone who was got disciplined, that was there.
A lot of discipline.
Oh yeah. But also I think, one part, especially maybe why I'm interested in my research is that, with faith, that they were a London Missionary Society and kind of converted into the Mormon Latter-day Saints, and that was, he had to wait. I think he had said it to wait till 17 or 18 before my grandma would let him do his thing. So,
go across,
but those stories, and it's interesting because one important thing I was thinking now is ages ago I wanted to be an astronaut. Because my dad was interested in space, and he taught me a lot about, so I knew a lot of my knowledge from him, and but he learned this in Niue.
Yeah.
So it's like, man, now I think I should ask him, what did you want to do if you could, kind of thing. But there's a bit of that stuff he always talked about. Yeah.
There's still time. You can still be an astronaut.
I can think I'm one.
That's funny. Did your dad have picked out careers for all of your kids?
No, but between him and my mum, because I think his family are more government, they work for the government.
Oh yeah.
So my family, it's like they're doctors. I try not to separate, but they're the ones who work for governments, were doctors and schools, and my mum was more, just knowledge of the area, the land and stuff. So he said he wanted to work in health. My auntie's a doctor and all that.
Oh yeah, now you're in health too.
Yeah, maybe a bit of that because of him. Plus my mum said, be a doctor. But no, it's interesting. And did your dad talk about some of the stuff he wanted to do in Niue or no?
Not that he wanted to do. I mean, he had real clear ideas about what he wanted all of us to do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So my older sister is a medical doctor, and he was that's the way for. But interestingly, all of us, he had picked different careers for all of us. So I think mine was maybe a teacher, which actually I really like. I always wanted to be a teacher for in primary school.
Yeah.
I would actually if the teacher was away, I would just take over the class and be like, I'll read you everyone a book.
I'll take care of you,
what a bossy, awful child. But then, he wanted my sister to be a policewoman, and.
So how many of you guys kind of in line with that kind of follow through?
I'm on the
because
researchers
teach you, don't you?
Yeah, it's connected, and I mean I do teaching as well. So still fulfilling my dad's dreams.
Oh, man.
But my sister's a doctor. I'm not sure. I can't remember what he wanted for my brother.
What does your brother do?
He is a diesel mechanic for Frontier. So he's kind of my scale of whether I've done well. Him and my dad. If I can impress either of them, then I feel like that's a success.
Oh.
Yeah, which I think. I don't think a lot of people outside of Pacific families necessarily understand that actually there's quite a lot of weight that we put with our parents in terms of, they have an ability to define whether we're successful or happy or not. My dad often serves me some curly questions. Just the other week, he's like, "Are you happy?" Out of the blue.
Oh,
and I was just it's not necessarily what I would ever expect from he's such a quiet stoic man,
but then
when he comes with his questions I'm like I want to make sure I'm doing all the right things in life.
I agree with I guess maybe it's a parent thing. My dad called me this morning.
Hey,
are you guys all good? Yep.
Yeah.
And but I guess it's something I thought of they always check on how we're doing.
Always.
And it might not even. It's a funny thing. I talk to my mum, and I don't know if it's a Pacific thing or families. They want to genuinely see how you're doing, but when you explain certain details, they'll forget. So I remember like, an occupational therapist and she used to tell, other family members that I'm a doctor. I was like, no, I'm not a doctor. But to her, I was like, oh cool, they're fine, they've got families, they're working. I don't know, it's like, I always wonder, like, man, is it because they're not interested in enough, or just kind of like overall? It's an overall thing, and like.
Yeah, I guess the professions that both of us are in, though, are not as straightforward as like
the common ones that you.
Yeah, I mean, up until I got my PhD, my dad always asked me like, "What do you do?
Yeah.
Like, what is it that you're doing now?"
You're at the uni, right?
Yeah. And I think it's so that you can explain to other people, because I feel like people often ask, like, "Oh, what do your kids do?"
Oh yeah,
and,
that's right. Yeah.
And you want to progress from, oh, she's a uni student, to like something.
Yeah.
Okay, Corey, so I wanted to pick up on one of the points that you said when you were starting Niue Language Week on campus at the University of Waikato. One of the significant celebrations we've had over the last 2 years was the introduction of Niue Club, as well as Niue Language Week, which have been fantastic and great big events despite the numbers here at Waikato. And it was awesome to see community members come on campus. How did you feel, and how did you feel about that, and how significant was that for the Niue community to come on campus?
I think it was really awesome, like when it all happened, and to see everyone there, but also the work that kind of had to be done beforehand, getting people involved. And it wasn't the easiest, but especially coming from Auckland, where there's, and coming to Hamilton, just to see, okay, it's a smaller community, but it didn't matter, because I think my family came from Auckland, people came down, and just to know that, it's this big. And there was also family I had not met before, or I remembered meeting them when I was younger. So it's just kind of connecting, and it's, big thing I think with Niue Language Week and including the community is, like for myself, was there are names and people that I kind of knew, and just to see them in person and to talk to them, and then they would remind me of who I am, and you look like, I'm like, oh, I don't even know. So there was that opportunity to kind of talk with, Niue people in Hamilton, and fortunately with, being the group at the university, we had the facilities to kind of come together. So from that point of view, that was the most important thing, is kind of reconnect and hear stories that I've not heard before, and kind of talk about who I am. And some of them even remembered me when I was younger, and I didn't remember them, And it was good to also have others participate in some of the activities, just to hear the stories. So overall, I think when it happened, it was good. It was cool that it happened.
And one of the fantastic events of Niue Language Week was a symposium that was held, in which you ran, Jess. So how significant was that in terms of highlighting Niuean research, or research on Niue, and how significant is it for Niuean people to be doing Niuean research?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the first thing is that we're not the first Niue Students Association. There was one, like, before my time, that existed. So we're kind of like reviving something that used to be here already. But for us, one of our first ones was having Tingalo Ness come, which honestly, Tingy is one of the Niue people who really just blows me away every time, because he has so much knowledge, but he is so warm and connects so well with the community, and not just Niue but across the board. So I mean, his talent is something that I always look up to, even though, I don't necessarily come from a music background, but you can always find meaning and kind of value in the kind of messages that come from people like Tingy. So that was such a privilege to have that on campus. And the symposium last year, we also had Tingalo.
Oh yeah, we'll have him again if you can. If he's available.
Yeah, for as long as Tingy's available, we'll invite him. But we also had Dr. Tom Ryan from anthropology, who did his master's and PhD research on Niue, share some of that information as well. And I think because at the time I was still completing my PhD, which was on Niue, and I was a Niue person, so that kind of had a really strong meaning to be able to share in that space. But you know, it's such an interesting thing, research, because you know, historically we've had a lot of these stories told to us by other people, and I think you know, there's been a few people before us in terms of like Dr. Nuhisifa Williams, she's done her PhD research. Terry Chapman also did some kind of like a Master of Administration, I think he did, thinking about the decolonisation of Niue. And so there's these people that we get to draw from, but it's not a really massive thing yet. And I think for us to be able to tell Niue stories in Niue ways is really, really important, and such a like an inspiring space to be a part of, particularly because we're both from the diaspora. Like we both grew up here. Our connection back home is limited in some ways, but we can still the questions that we ask in research, the way we do research, can still have a lot of significant meaning to the community, and I think that's cool.
One of the points I wanted to pick out as well, Corey, was when you talked about going back with your dad, and it was almost, as well as you, Jess, how they kind of just went back into, you know, island boy mode, if I could use that term. And you talked about how you wanted to be an astronaut because your dad was really interested in the cosmologies and indigenous. But what that indicates to us is a lot of indigenous knowledges are kept by people who are not necessarily in the research space. So how exciting is it for us as researchers to tap into those indigenous knowledges?
It's a big question too. But I've just recently been a researcher, like trying to, what is that? And especially researching like Pacific identity, spirituality and knowledge. This is all kind of a new, as of recent last couple of years, something prior to that I've more been working with people, so I've got that kind of knowledge. So I still say I'm new because I think I'm tapping into certain things. That thing about cosmology and, you know, I know for Pacific people, like spirituality and connection to the greater, it's huge, and it can reflect why there's some things that as Niue people, Pacific, we do things that are kind of over and beyond sometimes. I haven't made the link, but I know there's that through my work experience. So yeah, when researching, like where do I fit with that, bringing all this knowledge and try to, I don't know, normalize it, is that the thing? And make it more available for Pacific families, for Niue families, and not everyone will get it. That's the thing. I know it's going to be a big task, but if the people around you have that knowledge, and you know, you could see how that would affect the next generation. So yeah, that's where I'm at with that awesome question. If I want to, I'm just drawing on my experience and when I've worked with putting things in place that are not just physical. There's beliefs, there's all that stuff. Yeah.
And I think, part of the responsibility for a lot of like young or emerging Niue academics is actually kind of undoing the damage that was initially done by a lot of kind of the colonial Western systems of education that, you know, would literally punish people if they spoke the language or exhibited aspects of the culture that they weren't, you know, supposed to.
Yeah.
And so, you know, part of our work is like being like, no, our knowledge is actually valuable, and we can see that really clearly.
Yeah.
We just need to, you know, create more spaces where that's acknowledged and visible. And I think that's, you know, one of our responsibilities as in this space is to kind of create more spaces so that other people can come in, or, you know, that, on a really personal level, I have to be able to make enough space so that my dad sees that his knowledge is valuable.
Yeah.
Like, I can totally see it, but I have to convince him because he's grown up in a time where he got the
That's
cane
right,
or whatever, the tough gun you, I don't know, whatever they had in the
Everything
school.
that kind of just stopped any progression or...
And I think so that's really important in our space. And I mean, the other thing is that we are kind of like becoming springboards. So as much gain as we can make, so that when your daughters come along, they can springboard to the next level. So like we're here to kind of make sure that it progresses further, which I think is cool.
Cool, yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Really agree.
Opens up the space for thinking about what is Niue knowledge and who are Niue knowledge holders. And I, because growing up, the way I was educated was that, there's kind of less value or less consideration given to people in the working class. And I come from the working class. Like, my father is a blue collar worker, but growing up knowing what I know and being where I am now, I can see that actually for me some of the most valuable knowledge comes from people like my father. And you cannot get away from that, and being able to engage in your kind of home spaces and acknowledging your own parents, your grandparents, or your aunties and uncles, or even the people that raised you that aren't necessarily kind of blood relatives, because it's not uncommon for Niue people to be adopted out. But those kinds of connections, being able to respect that and value that is so incredibly important, and so exciting for us as researchers to be able to show respect for, but also to honour that knowledge. I think that kind of opens up the space for thinking about what is Niue knowledge and who are Niue knowledge holders. And I, because growing up, the way I was educated was that, there's kind of less value or less consideration given to people in the working class. And I come from the working class. Like, my father is a blue collar worker, but growing up knowing what I know and being where I am now, I can see that actually for me some of the most valuable knowledge comes from people like my father. And you cannot get away from that, and being able to engage in your kind of home spaces and acknowledging your own parents, your grandparents, or your aunties and uncles, or even the people that raised you that aren't necessarily kind of blood relatives, because it's not uncommon for Niue people to be adopted out. But those kinds of connections, being able to respect that and value that is so incredibly important, and so exciting for us as researchers to be able to show respect for, but also to honour that knowledge.
One of the questions I have for you is regarding when we're talking about reclaiming knowledges. One of not only through oral traditions and practices, but one of the key significant factors is looking at Niue in writing, Niue in texts. I understand, Jess, that you've been doing some research in that respect, and part of writing the New World project has been looking at Indigenous text. Tell us what you found, and what were the surprises, and just share a little bit about your work.
Yeah, no, it was super fortunate. I was really fortunate to be able to work with Dr. Alice Tupunga Somerville on writing the New World summer research last year, or over the summer break. And so I got to go back to Niue and go to Taonga Niue, which is directed by Moira Enetama, and she has been so supportive of the research that I've been doing. But they had the physical archive, so they had original copies of the Tohitala, which is the Niue newsletter, and I spent time, more like a lot of the time, just photographing, kind of like how you have done as well, Wanda, but just photographing a lot of them and then making them accessible to other people was one of the things that I wanted to do. And I kind of, while I was over there, I actually caught up with the Honourable former Premier Young Vivian, who really pushed me. He was like, okay, that's good what you're doing, but make sure that more people have access to it, and how are you going to make sure that this goes into the education system? And so, thinking about that is kind of an acknowledgement of the richness of the tohitala itself in terms of capturing part of Niue, like, lived experience from that time. And, it's so impressive, the number of Niue people who were contributing to that newspaper at the time. And that's the beauty of archive research, is that generations later I can go back and look at this stuff and pull out this, people like Malama Head who are writing, and they're like calling for Niue people to write cultural stories so that our younger generations are able to engage with them. And there's, coming from a time where often Niue people and Pacific people more generally were kind of thought of as challenged in a lot of ways, right? And that they couldn't, they couldn't access, higher knowledge, or that it wasn't really a space for them. And yet here these people are calling for cultural knowledge because they know how valuable it is. So yeah, I think those are the things. Probably my favourite story. So Malama Head is one of my favourite writers in there, but also the kind of series of origin stories that come through in correspondence there. It's such a fascinating way to learn about the history, even though it's kind of a contested space. Like, clearly these Niue people know that there's different stories, and that's kind of awesome. There's a richness to being able to engage in that I really love. Yeah.
Give us a bit of history with Tohitala. What's the Tohitala newspaper?
Yeah, so Tohitala was published by through the New Zealand Resident Commissioner's Office in Niue. A set of these kind of newsletters would go around to all of the different villages. Initially, it kind of started in the early 50s and kind of grew under the leadership or guidance of Jock McEwen. But Niue people were so enamoured, or certain Niue people, I should say, not all Niue people love the tohitala, but to the point where they would get written in articles as like, oh, make sure you share your copies of the tohitala because there's only a certain amount in the village, so you can't just hog it all the time. Which to me, I'm like, that's a clear indication that Niue people are, there's a hunger or an interest for writing and knowledge, and not just knowledge of Niue, but around the region, around the world. And this is happening in the kind of 50s and 60s and right through to today. So, to then turn around and think that Niue people don't really care about like knowledge or publishing or written work is a bit of I think that's a misunderstanding. Yeah, people who say that just don't understand. So yeah, that's kind of a...
What were they, the surprising findings in the tohitala for you? Were there any?
I mean, initially for me, I kind of have this with any Niue text, and I don't know if you kind of have this as well, but I always look for family in there because I don't know my Niue family very well. So I'm kind of always on the lookout for family names or names that my dad might have mentioned. So if I can pick them up, maybe I'll know a little bit more about the family story. And turns out my grandfather was a criminal, low-key. So that's kind of both surprising and like completely fascinating at the same time. Like I don't look on that with like a judgment or like, oh, how embarrassing. I'm like, oh yeah, go my grandfather. Like,
what was happening?
Yeah. Resist the system, which is one of the things. So the way that New Zealand or the kind of Palangi ideas with the tohitala was that they could tell Niue people how essentially to live their lives. So at the time, in the 50s, there's kind of a lot of ordinances coming out, actually before the 50s, so 40s as well. There's a lot of ordinances coming out about how you should keep your garden, so it should be so tidy to a particular level, otherwise you're going to get fined. Your house should be tidy. police had quite a high level of power in order to see whether people were going to church or not, see what they were doing. You couldn't sleep in another person's house if you weren't married to that person. Yeah. It was really strict.
All the rules there.
Even in terms of agriculture, you had to grow specific things because you had to feed the New Zealand colony. And I think that is overlooked a lot in terms of what Niue represented to the New Zealand kind of empire and what kind of produce was being made. And I find that stuff really interesting in terms of what that has led up to for contemporary Niue.
And I remember, I think there was, you said you're looking up some names, and there was, I think you shared a name of someone, I can't remember who it was, and it was a report card, which was cool. It was a story of, I think of Poimatangi, and
it was a Poimatangi.
It was a Poimatangi, and I showed it to, told my dad, like, did you know who this person is? And he wasn't too sure, because I think it was, he would have been a little baby. But I thought, this is your report card. I couldn't really read it properly, but I think the report card was good. I can't remember, but even just just that, I remember, like, we had no idea. There's something, just so there is a person. There's something you said, which I think is part of my wondering and questions about, like, the knowledge of, if the, like, I'm thinking of my parents, if they did they know about kind of like the effects of colonization, you know, like to grow things a certain way to act, and if they didn't, you know, what does that mean to them, you know, like, it's the thought of, like, what new knowledge it can be uncomfortable, you know, like, that kind of stuff. I was thinking,
I think this is one of the cool things about my research, is that the more Niue people I know, like Cori, whenever I see their names as well come up, I will send them like Facebook messages immediately. Like, Cori, is this your family?
I'll feed it to my mum or dad, and and then they will find out.
That's the thing.
They check, like, or they might recognise the name, but they're not sure, so they start talking.
But it triggers a whole bunch of conversations. And I had a similar thing with Piatolu, because I saw a Piatolu it can be mundane things. It was just that someone was part of, like, maybe a football team or something, and I was like, I'll see this quickly and see if he knows. And I think, even if they're mundane, they can mean so much more depending on who you send them through. Like my grandfather, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of your family were in this list as well, because it was like half of the village, but half of Mutalo people had not planted bananas. And they were on a list that's like, you guys are getting fined, or you can choose hard labour, like, up to you.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think, like, seeing that, I was like, who fines people for not growing a banana, or like an amount of banana?
And who was regulating it?
So that comes from the New Zealand Resident Commission, and they were tough. I mean, I'm almost glad that some people weren't able to read some of the things that they wrote, because they're so passive aggressive in terms of, like, trying to dictate, like, telling island people how to grow coconut trees. You just honestly, you're like, because these people never survived ever. So I think those kind of conversations point out a kind of the ridiculousness of some of the kind of colonial empire ideas about people. Okay.
Yeah. And so it seems like there's a real clear link with the archival research material that you've done, with possible links to the notions of resilience, happiness.
For a Niue person to do Niue research, there's a different level of care. Like, we would notice someone else's name, or we would notice our own family names in ways that, like, a lot of kind of other research doesn't necessarily acknowledge. And if you go in there with, kind of foreign models or foreign ideas to try and apply them, it means that you miss the richness of what happens. So, I mean, for me, thinking about climate change, there's no real reason for me to be having a nose into a book about, you know, all the lists of criminal records that doesn't necessarily tie into climate change at first glance, right? But then again, as you read that more, you kind of come to understand actually what's happening in these criminal records is changes in the dynamics of ways that people engage with the environment. And so, you know, there's kind of ways and ways of being able to connect in a space, and I think, you know, names is one, and the fact that we are drawn to these specific things. And I think even though we don't necessarily, like neither of us come from the island, we grew up in ways that are still very like intimately tied to what it means to be a Niue person. So the ways we're treated, the ways we think about respect, the ways we you know, are quiet and listen when people, when elders start talking, even if it's going for the third or fourth hour, like you still have to be respectful for that. And I think, you know, sometimes it's a hard way to learn, but ultimately what we're doing is really caring for our culture.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's kind of the key of Niue people doing Niue research is that we care. We love it so much. Like, it is so important to us because it is personal. It is family, and you can't untie those connections. And it's embedded in everything. It's not just people, but in taonga and you know, in the environment and making those kinds of connections. So yeah, I mean, it's a lifelong thing for me. I can't, now that I've learnt a little bit more, you know, I can see the road ahead is long. And,
cool. Oh, yeah.